Hey, folks. So today we're going to talk a little bit about sustainable development, and we're going to begin by reviewing the Millennium Development Goals, which were issued in 2000 by the United Nations, and uh, the the set goals for in various indicators to improve the human condition by 2015. Um, you can see that these are quite varied, reducing extreme poverty and hunger, universal education, promoting gender equality, reducing child mortality, improving maternal health, combating HIV/AIDS, ensuring environmental sustainability, and building a global partnership for development. So, um, very ambitious goals, all representing sort of common aspirations of humanity in some sense. And they were supported by United Nations agencies, such as the United Nations Development Program, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the bilateral aid agencies of the wealthy countries, and also, of course, the governments, NGOs in the developing world as well. So these were mainly goals focused on improvements in the developing countries of Latin America, Middle East, Africa, South Asia, East Asia. Let's look at a few of the indicators to see how well we've done on these goals. Well, in terms of poverty reduction, um, in the year 1990, you can see that close to 2 billion people lived on less than $1.25 a day. Now, I should add that $1.25 a day is a very minimal definition of, to say that someone has escaped absolute poverty if they make a dollar and 30 cents a day. That's still pretty meager living. Um, but it was seen as an objective to try to that below that it was considered that people really could not live a healthy or dignified life. So about 2 billion people lived below that level in 1990. By 2015, that had fallen to a bit over 800 million. So fell by more than half. So that's a significant drop. Now, unfortunately, in the past 8 or 9 months, actually, we've seen probably several hundred million people around the world who have fallen back under um, that bottom line of absolute poverty. And the reason is the consequences of the pandemic. It's not actually that all these people are ill with the coronavirus. It's more that the coronavirus has disrupted the global economy in ways that have undermined the livelihoods of many people. So um, it has reduced the demand for many of the agricultural goods and the raw materials and light industrial goods that are produced in developing parts of the world and often exported. So that has led to great increases in unemployment and declining wages and less money for governments to spend on social welfare. And so all of those things have led to a dramatic spike in poverty around the world. Now, hopefully, this will prove temporary, but it's likely that uh, it will take some time, some years, before we get back to where we were even a year ago. Primary education is another area where we've seen um, major improvements. This chart shows us net enrollment rates for primary education, and the blue bars are the rates in 2000, and the sort of gray bars are the rates in 2015. So you can see that there were enormous improvements in primary school enrollment in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia. a bit more modest improvements in Western Asia, Northern Africa, and not much improvement in Latin America, although Latin America was already the highest in 2000 among these regions of the world. What about gender equality? Well, that's quite multidimensional. This is only looking at one tiny sliver of the problem, but um, this chart does show the proportion of seats held by women in parliaments in different parts of the world, and you can see that again with the blue being 2000 and the gray 2015, um, quite significant jumps, especially in North Africa. Um, but even the most advanced region, Latin America, in 2015, 27% of the seats in parliaments were, or legislatures were held by women. So still a long way from gender equality. And that would be true in the United States as well, by the way, maybe even more so. Um, Reduction in child mortality. So many of the greatest improvements over that 15-year period took place in matters to do with health. And part of the reason is that um, public health interventions and technologies have allow even the poorest countries to make big progress with spending relatively little money. So, vitamin A or vitamin, A added to various kinds of foods, or um, the addition of salt to various kinds of staple foods, or vitamin D to milk, um, or vaccinations and inoculations, bed nets to deal with malaria. Um, a lot of these interventions make a huge difference to reducing ill health and mortality, but they really don't cost a lot of money. And yet there's been more money put into public health measures by not only public agencies like the UN, but also the Gates Foundation or other private foundations and efforts and NGOs. So, some countries in Africa, for instance, that have had their per capita income really hasn't increased much in decades, and yet they've seen declines in child mortality, they've seen increases in longevity, et cetera, because of public health technologies, medicines, even organizational and institutional changes that allow public health authorities to reach more people and more efficiently. So here is a measure of child mortality, the under 5 mortality rate between 1990 and 2015. You can see in every region there's been major reductions, but especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where rates fell by half, major improvement. So that's a very positive measure. Maternal health, another important problem where, without proper medical care, women die in childbirth. You can see that the rate of mortality from that source has declined everywhere. There's been a major effort to try to tackle HIV/AIDS around the world, including in the developing world, where major public health education campaigns on how to prevent HIV/AIDS transmission. The use of condoms has increased enormously, but also the deployment of antiretroviral drugs that allow people to survive even with the virus and to extend their life and their ability, their health. These drugs were initially very, very expensive, and there was a major campaign by NGOs and by governments to bring down the prices and so now they're provided at very low rates to developing country governments, which then deploy them to their populations. And as a result, you can see that the incident rate of HIV, which leads to AIDS, has dropped dramatically in most parts of the world, although it still remains a serious issue in southern Africa. Where we've seen less progress has to do with environmental issues. And here, the strains that humans are placing on the natural environment have only grown and continue to worsen despite many efforts to reverse those trends. And this has to do with what we call sustainable development, which was defined by a major report in 1987 as the ability of present generations of humans to provide for their own needs without so harming the natural environment so as to endanger the ability of future generations to do the same. So, in some ways, sustainable development is an oxymoron in the sense that we're talking here about development, and so development means growth. It means people having the opportunity to have greater material consumption and lives that are more, reflect greater abundance, but also to do so sustainably, to not harm the environment. Well, that's hard to do for people to engage in more resource intensive kinds of consumption and livelihoods, while at the same time sustaining the ability of the natural environment to provide for similar levels of consumption for people in the future. So in 2015, the United Nations launched a new initiative, having wrapped up the Millennium Development Goals. An even more ambitious set of goals were set. Now we have 17 rather than 8 goals. These were called the Sustainable Development Goals. They're not all directly related to the environment, but many of them are. We still have gender equality and poverty and hunger and education are still part of this, but we also have clean and affordable energy and sustainable cities and communities and responsible consumption, climate action, aquatic environment, life on land, the forest, sustaining forests. So we have a focus on the environment and as well as some of the traditional goals. Now, we know that there have been 2 major trends that have increased the strain placed on the natural environment. One is the enormous growth in human populations. Human populations were quite sort of, since the beginning of humanity until the last few hundred years, sort of trundled along at a fairly low level without dramatic increase. But as you can see here, looking at the sort of light green line, that the last couple hundred years have been a period of dramatic increase in human population. So lots and lots more people. The second element is the growing consumption per capita. So not only do you have many, many times more people than in the past, you have each individual is on average consuming far more natural resources, leaving a bigger, what we call, environmental footprint on the natural environment. So that means clearing far more forests to make way for farmland. It means depleting fisheries. It means putting carbon dioxide into the environment as we burn fossil fuels. And by the way, the burning of fossil fuels is central to all of this because it was the the discovery of the or development of the internal combustion engine, starting with steam engines and then um, you know um, piston engines that allowed us to multiply the amount of energy available to drive economic growth. Prior to, a couple hundred years ago, we mainly relied upon human muscle power, animal muscle power, as well as, wind power to for ships at sea or currents that drove windmills, and um, sun power that created crops that we could consume. But basically, there were very tight limits on the amount of economic growth and consumption that could take place at low levels of energy production. Once we developed the ability to extract oil and natural gas and coal, and then to the technologies to put those to use, we could, with ships and trains and cars and machinery and electricity, that was allowed us to vastly multiply the amount of energy we could put into producing and consuming goods. Now, you can see one of the quick, most evident consequences of the destruction of the forests and of the aquatic areas and wetlands is that the rate of species extinction has dramatically increased compared to the natural background rate. There's always some degree of species extinction that takes place in nature. Species go extinct, other species emerge, but there's some relative balance. You do have massive extinction events that are, with asteroids or with volcanic activity or with climate change in the past. But in more recent times, the vast expansion of extinction incidents have been driven by human activities, and you can see how closely correlated extinction rate increases are with population increase. Now, the good news, I guess, is that population levels are expected to peak during this century, probably at somewhat less than 10 billion people. We're currently at around 8 billion. So that's still a couple more billion people almost that will be added before we peak, probably in about 45 years from now. There are some models by which this could even, we may go past 10 billion, but you can see here that even by the end of the century, we'll still be about a little bit less than 9 billion, which is, a billion more than we have at present. So the rate of decline means that we will have very high levels of population for at least the next century or so. Now, the big consequence, of course, is that beyond all of the smaller scale activities that help to degrade the environment, disrupt ecosystems, and push up extinction rates, the big factor is the concentration of greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide, but also things like methane and hydrochlorofluorins. I think I said that wrong. But anyway, the greenhouse gases that trap heat into the atmosphere. Sunlight comes in, and when these greenhouse gases become too concentrated, then the heat is unable to escape back into outer space and is trapped into the atmosphere. And as the heat levels rise, that leads to the loss of coral. It leads to whole forests that are acclimated to a given climate all of a sudden are kind of out of place, that they can't survive under the new conditions. And there are many other effects that we'll be reading and talking about. But this looks at emissions of carbon dioxide between 1990 and 2012 in different parts of the world. And you can see at the far right that global levels have increased dramatically, despite the fact that back in the mid 90s we signed the Kyoto Protocol, which was meant to address the problem of global warming, and we haven't even started to a downward movement yet in carbon emissions, much less carbon concentrations. So we're at a point now where we probably have about a decade in which to take really dramatic action. If we don't, even if we do, we're going to see dramatic changes in, for instance, our coastlines, where the rise of sea levels will force building enormous seawalls or moving people inland. But even if we don't make some dramatic efforts to reduce carbon emissions, then we're looking at truly catastrophic and nightmarish consequences that we don't even want to consider. And unfortunately, that will be within your lifetimes and that of your children. So I don't mean to be, my purpose here isn't to frighten you, but it is to tell you the truth. So the big picture is, on the one hand, we've made a lot of progress on many indicators of human well-being. We've been able to bring down poverty. We've been able to improve education. We've been able to dramatically improve public health in many ways. But we have not yet dealt with environmental sustainability. You can see here some rather worrisome statistics. 85% of the world's fish stocks are overexploited or depleted. 5.2 million hectares of forest, an area the size of Ireland, are lost each year. The world's wetlands have shrunk by half since 1900. Coral reefs that sustain a quarter of marine fish species will shrink by half within 30 years. India will exhaust 60% of the nation's aquifers by 2030, and we're talking about 20% of the world's population there. The water table beneath China's northern wheat-growing region is falling by 1 meter per year and could be exhausted by 2030. That between India and China together are 40% of the world's population. And if the already severe water shortages in those countries become even worse because aquifers are depleted, that's quite horrific. So there's a lot to do. Your generation, unfortunately, is going to be have to do a lot of work. The exciting thing is that you can make a big difference, not only in your personal choices, but mainly in pushing the institutions, our corporations, our governments, our NGOs, to tackle these problems. And there are ways to do that. And you can make choices about your own careers that certainly give you opportunities to tackle these issues from a variety of different perspectives and skill sets. All right, folks, that's the wrap for today. Thank you.